Great, and I'd like to kind of start the questioning off. We've got about 20 minutes for questions before we hit lunch and the demos. The one that springs to mind in George's presentation is the business model. In the business case, they're often cost-driven, right? What are the costs? Anoop mentioned trying to get the cost down to below $5,000 per unit, and Mike mentioned kind of we're starting at a baseline of about $80,000 per unit right now. I don't think Jesse mentioned the cost he's shooting for. I think Dennis and I've talked about kind of it depends on the range of costs. But let me ask kind of the first four presenters kind of how you see the trade-offs between the cost of a sensing device, and then its networking components, and feed it into the network, whether the back-end database or the front-end display, but also the how this that end unit, the costing of that end unit drives these things, and how that potentially might present a dilemma for the traditional spectrum analyzer technology, some of which are demonstrating, I think, at lunch as well, that typically sell very expensive boxes, and they're very complex boxes. Can you guys just quickly summarize some of those trade-offs and kind of what you see as the kind of key cost target points?
We did a bit of research on this early on, so I'll take a stab at it. What we found is that there's essentially a step function at about 3 gigahertz. Now, the data is about a year old, so maybe a little bit out of date, but we found that sensors and detectors below 3 gigahertz tend to range between 2 and 5 times less than sensors and detectors that can range above 3 gigahertz about. There's also a difference in antenna kit. The two antenna kits are not compatible. So you can get a wideband antenna kit with relatively flat gain that can go up to 2.5 to 3 gigahertz. But you can't get one, but you need an entirely separate antenna kit to detect above that. So your antenna kit gets more expensive if you're doing significant wideband detection. So from our product development perspective, we essentially cut it off at 3 gigahertz and developed our own internal product because we needed a sensor that went up to 3 gigahertz. Now, there's another economic threshold, which is what are you trying to measure? How much are you trying to measure? And from what we found was if you're actually trying to peek into the signal, you pay for that capability. If you're simply trying to make an accurate measurement of energy, you can save a lot of money if that's what you're looking for. So if you draw back and you sort of, I guess, place some parameters or some boundaries on the amount of information that you actually need to collect, you can save a lot of money on the unit cost of the device. And then what we tried to do was to make up that functionality in software. With varying degrees of success, but those are the principal economic thresholds that we found was a 2 to 5x increase in cost when you cross that threshold, and then a completely separate antenna kit. The $5,000 range, that's about accurate. We are looking at about $5,000 installed. So take that into account. We have a completely different model, though. However, we don't sell the actual devices; we sell the data. So we lease the data, or rather, we lease access to the data, and we run the devices. So that was the marketing, the cloud slide that went over.
So just our initial investigations really have found that those COT sensors fall into more or less 4 tiers. There's the laboratory tier that's greater than 50 gigs. There's a mid-level tier that's somewhere from 10 to 30. Then there's a low-cost tier and an ultra-low-cost tier that utilizes a lot of these programmable chipsets. And I mean, just like any product out there, I think that there's a correlation between cost and RF performance metrics. Now, we recognize that a lot of the programmability that's offered in the low-cost sensors can be used to basically enable some of the capability that comes in the box of the high-end sensors. And so that's really what we're going to start working towards, is really trying to utilize some of the programmability of those boxes. That being said, there are some very important RF metrics that need to be characterized, one of which is the dynamic range of these, spurious-free dynamic range. I mean, that basically gives you the window of to measure in. And the 3.6 gigahertz scenario, for example, these transmitters are 1 million watts of power. So you can't just stick some limited range, dynamic range in there, because you're going to smoke it. I mean, we brought it, the $80,000 box that we used out there, and we cut it off in frequency so that it was only coming into the code channel band. We still had overloads, measured overloads on there about 12 times over the course of about 2 weeks. So that's in taking good care with the high-end box. We still encountered overloads. So it's important to keep track of those metrics.
So I think one thing you're going to see over time is that the price of the RF sensors is going to drop as one, you get more volume out of them, and two, like technology improves. But one of our goals is eventually to have like a sub $1,000 scenario where we can enable it. And one of the big reasons and drivers behind that is that if you start looking above the 3.5 gigahertz range, you're starting to look at point-to-point communications, and the number of sensors that you would need, and the number of antennas that you would need to actually be able to measure at, say, the 5 gigahertz range is about 1 every 50 meters. So in order to do a measurement in an area, like say you take Tyson's Corner, you may have to actually set up an entire network, measure for a period of months, do some analysis on it, and then take that same investment in hardware and move it to someplace else to do that same measurement and monitoring, unless you want to actually have that there permanently, in which case you're paying for it. And there's also the additional cost of the actual database hosting, where you're talking about a lot of data if you're talking about the raw data going up to these databases. So someone's got to pay for that use, so you have to have an investment there. And I'm sure that Mike's looking at right now in terms of what that's entailing. If you look at the architecture, I've got the nice part is I got something called Azure in my back pocket. I think Mike mentioned it last time we had a call. It's a nice thing to have, but it doesn't solve everything, right? So you've got to look at these various different components of the cost. The general labor, the basic hardware like the antenna, the cabling, those things aren't going to change. It's the RF sensor and basically the storage of the data.
Actually, it's an extremely complex question that you ask. As I'm sitting here thinking about it, is the sensor itself, at that level, we have $11 sensors, and we have $80,000 sensors. We have antenna systems that are $175 that do go to 6 gigahertz, but they're omnidirectional and they're not entirely even. And we have boxes that are very specifically tuned to both directionally and to a specific bandwidth. So the tricky part of this whole question is, what is it that you want to see? Are you interested in seeing broadband? Are you interested in seeing time discrete elements, like when we do our work with the folks in the public safety arena with land mobile radio? You want to see discrete activity levels. You have to be scanning at a very, very fast rate. So there's always a trade-off of, do I want to spend a minute going through the whole cycle, or do I need to be there in sub-second time frame to be able to see discrete activities? The other key element is this whole business, once you get through the sensors and the filters on the front end to mask those high wattage kinds of outputs like FM radio or television or those kinds of things, once you've gotten through that side, then you have the whole cost of installation. I painfully discovered, actually, as we worked with Microsoft to help put their first system up, that in some places like downtown Seattle, it costs $500 a month to put anything on the roof. It doesn't matter what it is. This is just a little sensor. You know, we're not broadcasting. It's not a television tower. Then okay, we'll cut it to $400 then. But you know, there's a significant cost associated with just roof rights on many buildings. And then finally, you get into the network infrastructure when you're dealing with. We do not have the luxury of having Azure behind us. We have a 100 terabyte system, but it's a specific installation. When you're connecting to the internet, we discovered that to be able to afford access, we needed a 10 gigabit link from our 100 terabyte system into the internet, and that is not cheap either. So there are so many different elements that you have to deal with, and so much that you need to think about based on what you're really trying to see. And there's so many difficulties that have been created by people making declarative statements about what they're observing, when really you're seeing one thing when somebody else wants to see something else. And I made those caveats in the slide, half of which disappeared. You really have to consider that. And I think for the comments that Mario made with the European group that was looking at this was one of their big concerns, that when people came forward and talked about what they were doing in the spectrum space, it wasn't clear to the regulators that they would be able to derive the value because of the very specific things that they wanted to see in specific bands. So it's, again, a very complicated question with a lot of dimensions to the answer.
That's this complex question. That's why we're having everybody help with these issues and how they address the policy-related questions. I'm going to turn it over to the floor in a second. When did you want to do the Phil Donahue approach? You want to folks line up at the mic to ask questions for the last bit? But while you're doing that and raising your hands for questions, I'll ask our European colleagues about the cost question, kind of hit off what Dennis was talking about. Because in the U.S., the white space decision involving database approach versus sensing approach, a lot of it was hinged upon, in my opinion, unsubstantiated allegations of costs involving the sensing approach, while there was no quite indication of what the incremental cost of a database approach would be either for such devices. So has the cost element been integrated into the policy discussions as well within UK and Europe generally about sensing? Is that one of the reasons they may have some cold feet about it?
Okay. Well, I think the regulators in Europe don't care too much really about the cost aspect, as long as it is dedicated towards the operators, and that's what we currently experience. The model which is applied is quite complex, and we will also see that in the US once really this whole white space thing will take on. We must not forget the databases are currently under absolute no load. If we are talking about millions of such such frequency assignments per hour, when you are in a totally different scenario, and we will face when computer power necessity, which is completely different from what we have currently, and that is exactly what I meant earlier, when you are looking into such a computation power as it would be necessary for the UK approach. This will really drive costs to a new dimension. And by the way, the UK regulator now has in his approach also a measurement type of or a kind of sensing thing by forcing the device really to return the assigned channel, which so far would be possible in the communication protocols which are defined also in the US approach, but it was not mandatory so far, at least to my knowledge, not. Okay.
Anything else?
Oh, sorry.
Well, I think the cost is one issue, but that is not discussed so openly, I think, like there in Europe. We don't talk about money that openly. The other thing is that it's always a performance and cost trade-off. So when, for example, allowing sharing, so what are the mechanisms based on which the sharing will be done? And for sensing, the European regulators have been objecting it all along, ever since 2009, because they think that it's not reliable enough to protect licensed users, especially for the case of protecting licensed users. So database is the favored approach there in Europe.
Question from the audience.
Yes, question for the panel. It's about granularity and what we're doing now and what you think could be possible. Dennis, you mentioned directional antennas. I'm just wondering, are we sensing the spectrum with scanning phased arrays or directional antennas that are steerable in order to get granularity in space and maybe use the data more at the sensor? So that's one question. And then the second question is technology available today in all of your measurement systems for spectrum monitoring? If you were, say, looking at the Wi-Fi band and looking over a 20 megahertz channel or today's LTE, do you have enough granularity to determine when an additional user, if one additional user comes on, or is that too difficult to measure with the techniques today? And then thirdly, I know it depends what you're measuring, and Dennis alluded to it, there are many different factors, but what would the panelists say are the, say, one or two most important parameters or statistics that you found in characterizing spectrum usage or interference? Is it the amplitude probability distribution of raw power spectral density in a given bandwidth, or is it a time rate of change of power level? Maybe you could give some insight into what are the one or two key technical parameters you found. So just to summarize, directionality, are we using it? Number two, can you detect one user additional in a wide band spectrum with modern techniques? And third, what are the key one or two parameters?
No, and it depends.
Good answer. Quick.
I'd agree, actually. It's pretty accurate. Even if you're talking about one user, unless you're constantly monitoring that and you've got the right a number of sensors in a given area, I don't think you'll be able to do that. If you start going down that path, saying, okay, I've got 3 sensors in an area, 2 sensors in an area, and then I'm constantly monitoring a specific area of the spectrum, yeah, you could do it. If you look at what's coming out of MIT recently, they can actually sense when a person's breathing. If you can sense a person's breathing, and when they stop breathing, you can basically sense an LTE user.
I noticed that you guys are using discones. We use also an omnidirectional antenna, mostly because of the geographic diversity. You need to be in front of the beam for those higher frequencies. We don't look for single users. We have in FDM networks, so for example, one fun thing to do is to watch Dulles Tower and Dulles Ground. You can tell when new planes are coming in simply by watching the chirps, so you can see that in FDM, but that's a completely different scenario. In a shared environment, that's not something that we're looking for. The sensors that our system uses don't peek into the signal like that. It's certainly possible to identify that if you are going to do some basic demod, if you're going to do some channel surfing that way. From a statistics perspective, our folks want to know, is the band suitable for use, right? If it's unlicensed and it's occupied, how occupied is it? And if it's unlicensed, or rather available, are there unlicensed devices in the band, or even not in the band, but located nearby that could potentially enter into the band? And then on the flip side, are there transient licensed users that have incurred into the band to block it? So our folks, or our users, look more for sort of gross occupancy as opposed to fine-tuned occupancy rates.
We more or less use omnidirectional antennas and just take in what we can from the environment across the whole thing. In time, I think, yeah, we can. There are sampling devices where you can pick out. Heck, I could pick out really thin pulses from a radar pulse. So you can scheme these things however you want to do it. It's just a matter of how you do the signal processing. I think in terms of the statistics, that's really complicated, and I think that's why we're dividing up into 3 groups here, because I think the statistics are different for whatever you want to do. For instance, for the policy group, I would imagine that Tom Power would like to be able to sit at his computer and hit a button and get a report, a band occupancy report, over like a year's worth of information to identify an underutilized band of some kind. And then he might be able to bring that to meeting, and they'll say, well, that's last year's stuff. Well, next year is going to be different, and he can pull out another. Long-term statistics are important, and it's band occupancy really is that really important metric. APDs, I mean, when you start talking about coordinating spectrum usage, then you're talking about much more detail on a much finer timeline and much more recent type of usage. APDs, give you the distributions of what you measured. I think it's more of percentage of usages across the band that you really want to take a look at.
All right, do we have time for one quick question? Wendy? All right. Yeah, we hear you.
John, Barry, we can hear you.
So, my question is, are any of you considering using the airplane sensors? And if so, what do you see as the advantages and the challenges?
Garrett, do you want to take that?
Sure.
You have a helicopter pilot.
It always depends on the case, what you want to do. An airborne sensor can have enormous advantages when you, for example, want to measure a satellite link, because normally you are not able to detect the uplink. If you are above the link, you are able to identify it. It's also interesting, for example, to get the propagation characteristics of a tower, which you normally would have quite a problem. But whether it is useful in every case, that is very doubtful. It is more effort, and you have comparable low on time, because you have to refuel the aircraft, or you have to bring in new electricity, whatever. So it's also a time question.
Hey, anybody else?
Sure. I may have clicked this off. Can you still hear me in the back? Okay. The airplane question is actually one that we were discussing on Friday. Mark Gibson sitting here, and Mark McHenry and several others are owners of airplanes and love to have the opportunity to do this. And for me, having colleagues in DARPA here and in NSF, I would be delighted on behalf of Illinois Institute of Technology to be in receipt of an airplane so that we could do these measurements. Because they have enormous value. I mean, being more serious, there is huge value in having the unobstructed view of the spectral range. But you actually need all of these different techniques. You need individual sensors. I don't know, 50 meters, or but some places, yes, you need them very, very tightly located. You do need beam forming, per Ted's point. You do need our tall buildings. You do need long-term. You do need short-term. What is critical with all of these different techniques and different observation platforms, and a huge research topic, is the fusion of the data. Because that's, in the end, what you need. It's like the blind children and the elephant, and the different perspectives on what an elephant is based on where you happen to be standing next to the elephant. But the key is bringing them all together and being able to make sense out of all these measurements. But back to the question, the airborne aspect is a critical component to the collage that you need to bring together to really understand the spectral usage.
All right, our time is up, and we're going to continue all these discussions and great questions at lunch and in the breakout groups, and I appreciate this overview from the panel. It was very good, and please join me in thanking the panel.